Hi! In this video I'm going to talk about the books that I've read this month, and hopefully you find some books you want to read yourself. I'm Øystein and I'm trying to become a bookworm, and hopefully I can inspire some of you to do the same. Wrap-up videos are becoming one of my favorite videos to make, just because it's fun to revisit the books you've read, and I also feel a great deal of accomplishment when talking about the books that I've read. And I think we'll just jump straight in to the biggest accomplishment for me as a reader yet, and that's reading Sigriunset's Kristin Lavransdatter. For those who are especially interested, you can watch my full review video of this book on my channel. I'm not going to deep dive into this at all at this moment, just talk briefly about it. Sigriunset got the Nobel Prize for Literature for this book mainly. This book consists of 3 books. So the first one came out in 1920 and the last one came out in 1922. It's set in the 1300s Norway, and we meet Kristin, which is a way more capable woman than she should be for the times they were living in. She's born and raised on a big farm in Gudbrandsdalen, Norway, to a middle class or upper middle class family. And one important thing about her upbringing is her father and the strong role he plays in her being, so I think we'll call it independent, because she likes to do things her own way and decide what she's going to do herself, which doesn't really fit in with the society she lives in. She's set to marry this guy called Simon, but she falls for this handsome guy called Alan, which doesn't have the best reputation. It's 1200 pages and a lot of things to say, but if you're really interested, I would check out my review or just read the first book, because they're sold separately as well. And the first book I really loved, so I would recommend the first book and not the other ones. I was really surprised when I started reading the first book, only because it was so powerful. It created very visual images in my head, and I at once felt that I was a part of the 1300s Norway, which is great when you're reading a book and trying to engage. It felt sort of like reading a fantasy novel, just because the world is so different from the world we're living in now. You have people on horses with swords and spears, and they're going up to the mountains. They have to be aware of thieves. So many similarities towards fantasy. In the first book there was also a lot of world building and a lot of things happening, fast paced, so that one I really enjoyed. The second book was more about the struggles of being a wife, and being a wife at that time where she had to be alone with all the kids that she had given birth to, while the husband doesn't really act kindly, to say it mildly. So the first book really loved, second book didn't enjoy at all. The third book was okay. It had more endings, I would say. So the second book was more I feel bad, and I feel bad because I'm not supposed to feel bad, but I feel bad, and that's bad. But the third book was I feel bad, and then this happened, and then somebody dies or somebody doesn't feel bad anymore. I don't have strong feelings for the last book. So now there is a couple of weeks since I finished it, but I haven't thought about the last book at all. So you might say that the first book I really enjoyed, and that makes me remember it, and the second book really annoyed me, so I remember it well. And the third book was more like, eh. All in all, I'm really happy I read this book, and it feels like my biggest accomplishment yet. So good on me, and hooray, I'm never going to have to read it again. Might actually read the first book again in 50 years or something like that, but we'll just have to wait and see. My next book was actually an audiobook, and it's my first ever, and it was A Tale of Terrible Times by Olaug Nilsen. I was going to drive 8 hours one day, and I decided that this is the perfect opportunity to try out an audiobook and see what the fuss is all about. I did not know anything about this book before I started listening, but it turns out that this book actually is about the author's own son, which developed autism, and it's written in the second person, from the mother to the son. The son is a healthy kid, but suddenly he sort of stagnates, and the parents don't know why. They seek out help, and that's what the book is all about. How the parents experience him at home, with him being outgoing and being violent, and then how they seek out help and how they meet the people that are trying to help them. The reason I think this is a great novel is that I, as a listener, was exhausted when listening to this book, just because I could feel how hard it must have been for those parents to experience the things they were experiencing. I really recommend this book, even though I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. That was more because I felt like this was a non-fiction, but it's categorized as a fiction novel, and it's told like a fiction novel, but sort of not. Difficult to explain. If you're part of the health sector or just in a situation where you meet parents that have kids with autism, for example, it could be other diagnoses as well, I think this would be really useful to read. That was the second book I got through this month, and sort of a weird book to have as my first audiobook experience, but I'll come back to that later. The third book I finished this month was Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari, The Search for the Truth About Addiction. And this book is about the war on drugs. It takes us on a journey to the early 20th century and when the war on drugs started, and until 2018 and how things are going. Johann Hari was one of the future stars of journalism, but then he started plagiarizing. Then he went underground, he got fired from the job he had at the Independent, and he started writing this book. One of the advantages of having done a bad job earlier is that you now spend 25% of the book having references to the things you write about in the book. One thing people say about Johann Hari's work is that he often takes things that are obvious for the people that are involved in the subjects and just popularize it. Makes it popular. This is a New York Times bestseller, and I really understand why. It's a storytelling technique that just mesmerized me. He gives you cliffhangers and then he tells you what's coming next and then drags you back down. It's sort of like a symphony of reading because it has a rhythm that you could recognize, and you always are intrigued to know what's going to happen next. The stories are very personal and they're from all the sides of the drug war, so the police, the addicts, the drug lords. On many occasions while I read this book I had goosebumps all over my body, and not the good kind, the hurting kind, and that's a thing I don't know if I've experienced before. You just feel bad for the people involved in the whole war on drugs. So that was number 3. Then I thought I would get in a better mood, and then I seeked out Neil Gaiman again, and this time The Ocean at the End of the Lane, a book that has been standing in my shelf for way too long. This is a book I didn't quite grasp what was about before I started reading, and after I started reading I also struggled to find out what this book was about. We meet a man that comes back to the place he grew up because he's attending a funeral. He sits down by a pond where he once met a girl called Letty, and she called this place an ocean. And from there on out he tells a story from when he was around 7 years old, and it's a short period of time, but let's just say that a very large amount of things were happening at that time. I actually have no idea how I'm going to tell you some parts of the story without telling you all of it, so I'm just going to stop there. But again, as with many other Neil Gaiman's books, we are talking about parallel universes, or a universe where creatures come into the real world from another place, and weird things are happening all over the place. I thought it was kind of hard getting into the novel. After a while I sort of understood how things were connected, and it became easier but still a bit confusing. I would make a parallel to Coraline, which I read last month, because this is also about a young boy and he's sort of on his own adventures, and the family doesn't understand much about how he is feeling. It's said at the end of this book that this is the first book Neil Gaiman wrote where he didn't actually know who he was writing for, so he didn't actually know if it was supposed to be a children's novel or a book for adults. I would say that this really isn't a children's novel, and it's also a novel that after I read it I didn't think it was all that great, but it made me really reflect on how the kid behaved and what he was thinking about and how he viewed the world. And I think that's the point of this book, making us see the world through children's eyes, not only in the good way but also in the very negative way, them being naive and not understanding the world around them maybe. It was quite an interesting book to read. I gave it 3 out of 5. I have regrets, and my regrets are that I didn't read it slower, so I sort of rushed through it because I have to get through books sometimes. And I have to read this once more at some point because I felt I was missing out on a lot of things, and also I didn't have the right expectations because this isn't fun at all. This is just thought-provoking in a very mild way. Making book reviews is hard. But that was number 4. Then I decided I was going to try this audiobook thing once more, just because I forgot to cancel my free trial. Oh, I'm kidding, but also not. And this time I decided to do some research, so I chose Lars Mytting and The Bell in the Lake. This is one of the most popular authors in Norway at the time, and the book is also quite popular in Britain. It is one of 3 books, and 2 of them are published, and the 3rd one is coming. It's set in the 1800s Gudbrandsdalen, the same place as Kristin Lavransdatter, and here also we meet a woman called Astrid. Astrid is also a very independent woman and a woman with her own opinions that makes her difficult for the men around her to be around her. So there are quite a lot of parallels between those 2 books actually. In the start of the book we meet a couple of Siamese twins. They have lived on Astrid's farm 200 years before, and when they died 2 church bells were created, and these were called the sister bells. These bells are of course something magical, both in how they sound but also in the myths that are created around them. One day a new priest arrives in the town and he is called Kai. Kai is very fascinated by Astrid and vice versa. But one day Kai says that he thinks that the town needs a bigger church because the church they have doesn't fit the standards that are supposed to be in Norway at that time, and so he decides to sell the church to Germany. And from Germany we get an architect that's called Gerhard, and he's supposed to make sure that the church is traveling nicely to Germany again. This German fellow is also quite interested in Astrid, and when Astrid learns that Kai is sending her sister bells down to Germany, she is not happy. I really struggled with this novel. I don't know if that's because I listened to it or if it would have been different if I read it. Firstly, this is a novel that really should engage me because it's a novel with a historical aspect, which I tend to enjoy very much. Firstly, there were way too many words. All the things in the book were described quite heavily. So when describing a rope, you might say that this rope was shaped from 1,000 years of cow herding in the mountains, where the salt water was also present in the grass on the mountaintop. I know that that sentence didn't make any sense, but I hope I got the point across. Also, all my grudges about this book is about how the author himself talked when he read this book, because he tried to make so many dialects that just sounded, let's just say, bad, and I'm not exaggerating, to say the least. It was quite gruesome. I'm going to listen to more audiobooks now just because I have to form an opinion and I have to get as much input as I can, so I'll manage to say something constructive. But I think I would have enjoyed this book much more if I read it. I did get some new knowledge about Norway at that time, which I always enjoy. I think I gave it 3 stars. It could easily be 2 and it could easily be 4, but I think that's the author's fault, so I think 3 is reasonable. I made a video about audiobooks earlier on my channel, and I think that's one of my favorite videos, just because the comments I got from that video was so different. I truly think that that's a great thing about this community, because I always learn something and no one reads or listens the same way, and that is fascinating. Then we are going to visit the complete opposite side of the scale, and it's If Cats Disappeared from the World by Genki Kawamura. This book I had very high expectations for, and I thought this would be a funny read, but it really wasn't. It's about this man that gets the message that he is going to die. He then gets a visit from the devil that tells him that if you only make one thing disappear from the world each day, you're going to live 1 day more. This book is very short. It's about 200 pages as well, but basically it's about 80 or something like that, because there's so much space, which I tend to enjoy very much. But this book is actually the first book I have ever written where I thought it was too few words. So there is almost no description of anything in the world. It's just things happening, and the things that are happening is things that I thought, well, that's going to happen, and it did. Very predictable book, and that I didn't expect at all. I thought the title would suggest that this was a very inventive book, but I really didn't think it was. And he's looking at his life that has been and thinks about what he should have done differently and how life could have turned out, but really not in a way. It's very half-heartedly. He's sort of, well, if I did that, when maybe that could have happened. And then nothing. It ends there. Quite provoking. One of the things he makes disappear from the world is mobile phones. And okay, what's going to happen if you remove mobile phones? Well, he doesn't know if people are going to show up when they agreed on meeting somewhere. That's basically how far they view the consequences of his actions in this book. As you might have noticed, I was a bit fed up with this book. I did not see the point in this book at all, and I was very, very disappointed. Well, maybe this is one of my biggest surprises as a reader yet. Maybe we'll just blame it on the translator. Have no clue, but that was the 6th and the last book I've read this month. Or listened to, whatever you prefer. I'm still not counting audiobooks as reading for my reading goals, so I have to read 53 books this year outside of my audiobooks, but audiobooks are a great way of finding new authors and getting new books into my system. So these were the books that I read and listened to this month. I hope you got some suggestions for what you might want to read at some point. And if you want to check these books out, there will be links in the description. Still, give me recommendations if you have books that you think I would enjoy. And thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next week. Bye!